My name is Dahlia, and I am 28 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that the shape of me was somehow wrong, that I had been assembled with a flaw no one else could see but everyone could feel. Because when your own father calls you the problem child for as long as you can remember, the words stop sounding like an opinion and start sounding like a diagnosis, like something printed quietly into your DNA, something permanent and inescapable. And so I grew up inside that diagnosis the way other children grow up inside warm houses, adjusting to its temperature, learning its corners, memorizing the exact tone of voice that carried it across dinner tables and through car rides and into the small, vulnerable spaces of my chest. And it followed me everywhere, to school where I second-guessed every raised hand, to friendships where I apologized for taking up space, to relationships where I worked twice as hard to prove I was not too much, not difficult, not defective, because being labeled the problem child does not simply describe you. It rearranges you. It teaches you to monitor yourself constantly, to anticipate disappointment before it arrives, to shrink preemptively so that no one has to ask you to. And the strangest part was that my father never looked like a villain in the obvious ways. He did not shout or slam doors or leave bruises that could be photographed and explained. His cruelty was quieter, more refined. It lived in comparisons and sighs and the subtle narrowing of his eyes whenever I spoke. In the way praise for my brother came easily and praise for me came with conditions or caveats or a waiting period, as if my success required verification before it could be believed. And when I was 6 and spilled juice on the carpet, it became evidence. When I was 10 and struggled with math during the year my mother was ill, it became confirmation. When I was 14 and my brother was caught lying, somehow the tension still bent toward me. Because in our family gravity worked differently, it pulled everything in my direction. And I absorbed it the way children do, without question. Because children assume their parents are narrators of truth. And if the narrator says you are the problem, you begin to search for the flaw within yourself rather than the lens through which you are being viewed. And so I tried to correct myself endlessly. I tried to be quieter, kinder, more helpful, more invisible. I rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. I monitored my laughter to ensure it was not too loud. I edited my opinions to ensure they were not too strong. And still the label remained, stitched into the fabric of our home, repeated at gatherings in half-joking tones that never felt like jokes to me. And what hurt most was not even the word itself but the certainty behind it. The way my father delivered it, as though he were stating a fact about the weather, something objective and beyond debate. And I remember winning an academic award once, standing in the living room with the certificate trembling slightly in my hands, hoping this would finally tilt the scales, and he looked at it, nodded once, and said, "Let's see how long this lasts." And in that moment I understood that my achievements were not building a new identity. They were temporary interruptions in a story he had already decided about me. And I carried that story into adulthood, into my apartment, into my career, into the quiet hours of night when doubt grows loudest, and even when I began to build a stable life for myself, even when colleagues described me as reliable and friends described me as thoughtful, there was a part of me waiting for the old verdict to surface, waiting for someone to discover that beneath the surface competence I was still fundamentally the problem child. And then one evening at a family gathering, an aunt made a comment that should have been insignificant. A passing observation about how I never really looked like my father, followed by a quick laugh and my mother's immediate shift of subject. But something about the timing, the tension, the way the room seemed to inhale and hold its breath, lodged inside me differently than before. And once doubt enters through even the smallest crack, it begins to widen it from the inside. And I started noticing things I had overlooked for years. The absence of resemblance between my father and me. The way relatives hesitated before commenting on my features. The way childhood photo albums were navigated carefully, as if certain pages carried static electricity, and I tried to dismiss it. I told myself families are complicated and resemblance is random and imagination is powerful. But the questions did not quiet. They grew sharper, more insistent. Until one night alone in my kitchen with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of 28 years pressing against me, I ordered a DNA test, and even as I clicked confirm I felt disloyal. As though curiosity itself were a betrayal, as though seeking clarity meant accusing my mother of something unspeakable. Yet beneath the guilt was a deeper need. A need to understand whether the distance that defined my relationship with my father had roots deeper than personality or preference. And when the kid arrived, I left it unopened for days, aware that inside that small box lay the potential to either confirm my fears as irrational or confirm them as reality. And the waiting after I sent it back was its own quiet torment. Every phone call from my parents felt loaded. Every memory replayed itself under new lighting. And then the email arrived, ordinary in appearance, catastrophic in implication. And I opened it with shaking hands and read the results once, twice, 3 times, hoping numbers might rearrange themselves if I stared long enough. But they did not. And in that dim kitchen light I learned that the man who had raised me, disciplined me, labeled me for nearly 3 decades, was not biologically related to me at all. And the shock was not explosive but disorienting, like the floor had shifted a few inches to the left and nothing aligned the way it once had. And suddenly memories reorganized themselves into a pattern that made terrible sense. The hostility that felt too personal, the disappointment that felt too absolute, the undercurrent of something unresolved humming beneath every interaction. And I drove to my childhood home that same night without fully deciding to. The printed results crumbled slightly in my grip. And when my mother opened the door and saw my face, she did not look confused. She looked defeated, as though a clock she had been listening to for years had finally struck midnight. And I handed her the paper and we stood there in silence thick enough to touch. And tears filled her eyes, not with shock but with recognition. And slowly in fragmented sentences the story surfaced. A relationship before marriage she believed was finished. A pregnancy discovered too late. A truth concealed out of fear and desperation. And my father learning early enough that the knowledge had time to calcify inside him. Choosing to stay yet never fully choosing to forgive. And I understood then that I had been living inside the shadow of a betrayal that was never mine. That the label problem child had been less about my behavior and more about his unresolved pain. That I had become the embodiment of a wound he did not know how to heal. And when I eventually sat across from him with the results between us, the air felt heavy with decades of avoidance. And he did not deny it. He did not argue with science or attempt to rewrite history. He simply looked older than I had ever seen him. And when he spoke, his voice lacked its usual sharpness. And he admitted to the bitterness he had carried, to the unfairness of directing it at me, to the terrible ease of turning silent resentment into subtle cruelty. And for the first time I saw not the towering figure of my childhood but a flawed man who had allowed pain to distort his love. And the revelation did not erase the years or magically transform us into something whole, but it shifted the axis of my identity. Because the narrative that had defined me for 28 years dissolved in the face of truth. I was never inherently defective, never born with a tendency toward disappointment, never destined to be the family scapegoat by virtue of my character. I was a child born into secrecy and raised in the echo of an unspoken betrayal. An understanding that did not eliminate the scars but it relocated their origin. It moved the flaw from inside me to the circumstances around me. And that relocation changed everything. Because when you realize the problem was never your existence but the silence surrounding it, you begin to breathe differently. You begin to occupy space without apology. You begin to rewrite the story you were handed at birth. And I do not pretend that forgiveness arrived instantly or that trust rebuilt itself overnight. But I do know that the day those DNA results came in was the day the word problem loosened its grip on my name. And for the first time in my life I looked at myself not as a verdict but as a person, complex and imperfect and entirely worthy of love untainted by resentment. And if there is one truth I carry forward, it is this. The roles we are assigned in childhood often say more about the unresolved battles of our parents than about the content of our character. And sometimes the most liberating discovery is not who your father is biologically, but who you are when you finally understand that you were never the problem to begin with.